This is part 2 of the lecture on rational religious ethics, and in this part we will be taking a look at the structura layout of religious ethics, followed by the benefits and problems of religious ethics. So, let's get started with the structura. Step 1 is the axioms. Axiom 1. The world is the intentional and purposeful creation of God, an ethical authority, judge, and enforcer. That is, the world is teleological. Notice that the nature of God is left vague here, and that's intentional. All the noted aspects are religiously universal. That is found in every one of those 6 major religions. Axiom 2. Human beings are the kind of thing that has an immaterial component, a soul, and has reason and free will, and therefore decides whether and how to actualize their telos. That means that every piece of creation without free will is both inherently in line with its own telos and cannot be judged, since it lacks the means to do anything other than what it is designed to do. Axiom 3. These two ideas are related by the notion that a freely chosen recognition and submission to telos allows humans to harmonize with the world. And this is the crucial submission factor that makes religion religion. Submission to the telos is the submission to the will of God, since the telos is the representation of that will. And that means placing the will of God as one's highest moral value, the thing we aim for. Notice also why Jung decided to call the highest moral value your God. With this explanation, you can see that this system was in place long before we got all philosophical about it. Alright, so let's look at the theory. As with Aristotle and every other teleological system, the default setting of a human being cannot be enough. If it were, we would actualize our telos by default. But because we have free will, that's no longer an option. We can screw up being a human. A squirrel can't screw up being a squirrel. So, what are the key human teleological points to actualize? Well, we have reason and emotion, and we make choices. So, emotion is the reaction factor. It tends to be oriented towards things like immediate gratification and short-sighted materialistic goals. Why is that? Because emotion is unstable, it's fleeting, it is outside of your control, and it is often sensory. In that respect, we are most animal-like. Think about how advertising works. It is sensory trickery to make you feel like you need this product, to make you feel hungry, and so on. Emotion is a generally negative aspect, primarily because it is so unreliable. This is the part of you that needs to be kept in check, generally speaking. Reason is your response factor, tending towards the meditative, contemplative, long-term understanding that goes far beyond the sensory and the material. It is stable. It is, in many ways, permanent. It is within your control. Because it turns away from the immediate material gratification, reason is the way that one can come to know God. Now, this is intended not in the sense of seeing God, but in the sense of following the idea of immaterial principles, like natural laws, to the conclusion of design or the source of existence. You find these arguments rather explicitly in thinkers like Ibn Masara, St. Augustine, St. Aquinas, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Tufayl, I believe Maimonides too. This is a general sense of the divine, but not the specifics or the hierarchical ordering of all values, and thus there is a need for an external source of details. Finally, that free will factor means that one must have the freedom to choose, even if poorly, in order to take on the responsibility for oneself as a teleological entity based on reason and free will. In the Bhagavad Gita, the royal cousins who are trying for a coup are permitted to try, despite their actions being evil. In the Old Testament, Satan is allowed to rebel despite that rebellion being an evil. In fact, in a particular sense, all evil religiously falls under the heading of rebellion against the will of God in one way or another, and it's predicated on knowing the right from wrong and then choosing wrong because you think that the immediate material benefit is the thing to aim for. Alright, so now we have reason and free will, but need that external source of details, and that's revelation, i.e. religious texts. So religious texts are the explanation and rules. They explain, by rational argument, who and what God is. Now you may be confused how that's an argument. Think of it this way. If I tell you that some object or force exists, and then define what it is and how it relates to the world, that is, by definition, an argument for a claim. Now this is an extrapolation of telos and its source. Next, the revelation specifies the concept of judgment and the consequences of that evaluation, which are heaven or hell, good or bad rebirth, etc. And here you find the idea that the notion of judgment is always based on truth, never on mere perception. And this is the extrapolation of judgment and enforcement part of the axiom. Finally, revelation offers up the teleologically correct relation between humanity, human telos, and the universal telos, what it means to submit, by presenting the hierarchy of values which tells you the do's and don'ts, the must and can'ts, how to sacrifice, what to sacrifice, and so on. And you'll notice that all three of these are a rational argument, because if there is a telos, then to know the telos means to be able to rationally discern the purpose and therefore how to best act to ensure that the human telos is in line with the universal one. And if there is a purpose and direction, then you need a purpose maker and direction setter. Again, notice that all these ideas apply to all six major religions. Despite their content differences, the structure is the same. So what does the practice look like? If one believes in God, and thus in the universal and human telos, then they ought to freely submit their will rationally to the proper teleological relations. In more simple terms, they need to aim for actualizing the will of God insofar as they're able to. And this is properly done only by adherence to either the obedience of a direct command or by comprehension of rational interpretations of those commands in new contexts. So, on to the world. If the practice matches the theory, what you have is the establishment of the will of God in the land. That is, the actualization of human telos and the protection of the universal telos of all other things. Additionally, because of the judgment component, the world extends to the post-mortem area, where the evaluation and judgment actually happens, where the truth of one's being and actions is considered and the enforcement of the rules is actualized. That is, through heaven or rebirth, advancement, or cessation of being, depending on the particular religion in question. Alternately, if the practice does not match the theory, then the result is chaos on earth and hell after. Why chaos? Because the proper practice is about making sure that things work as they are supposed to. When they don't, you have a broken system by definition. So that's the religious structura. Notice that it plugs in just as easily as any secular one in the exact same way and is just as rational as Kantian utilitarian or Aristotelian ethics. When viewed from this perspective of metaphysical architecture, the equality of theory structures across ethical theories is rather obvious. So, what are some benefits? Now, religious ethics give us a universal ethical system that applies to every person alike, in all places at all times. Because it is based on an objective universal standard, there is no room for your opinion or mine, at least not on the basics. Not to say that people don't disagree, but that the authority, judge, and enforcer are all the same for everyone, as explained in the last lecture, so no one cares what your opinion happens to be. And we can't say the same for utilitarian, Kantian, or Aristotelian ethics, and that's because they're based on human ideas. That's all they claim. And in that case, my preferences are just as good as Kant's, Mill's, or Aristotle's. That is, there is no objective reason for me to care what they said. I can pick the most nihilistic, self-serving ideology there is, and I can't be wrong because their systems are not pitched as universal systems, only as systems that would have meaning if I bought into their axiomatic assumptions. The same isn't true if there is an objective standard and there is absolute enforcement. Now, the fact that that enforcement may never come because there is no God is irrelevant here. What matters is that the secular position cannot have a universal status, not even theoretically. The religious position has it, at least in theory. Now, we will also expound more on this in our next lecture as we consider the concept of moral obligation. Benefit 2. This is the only system that actually gets us around the problem of justice and injustice raised in the Republic, and it solidly resolves the issue of the most just and most unjust man. All those benefits that are accrued by the most unjust man turn to ash in the final analysis and judgment, and all that suffering by the most just man is ultimately negated, and his justice is rewarded and paid out in full. The very notion of doing injustice now becomes incoherent because you cannot gain any kind of a meaningful benefit by doing so. The third and final benefit to consider here is one that we will only touch upon briefly. The religious ethical systems make moral obligations coherent in a way that secular systems seem unable to do. Now, for the moment, we'll just note that without pushing the reward and punishment for ethical and unethical behaviors into an afterlife, the secular theories tend to break down whenever they demand a cost be paid without the ability to recoup that cost. That is, we end up with the incoherence of altruism problem. Now, in the next lecture, we will explore this idea more closely. So much for the benefits. What are the problems of religious ethics? Problem 1 is teleology. This should have been expected since the same issue came up in Aristotle, but this time there is a difference in the answer. Now recall that telos is direction, goal, and direction of progress for a class of beings. The idea that nature has a telos was a core idea of all societies up until about 1850s, even when European Enlightenment had essentially rejected the role of the church and religion. The idea that there was a purpose to existence was retained. Before that rejection, telos was supported by religious ideas, but it stuck around even when the religious ideas were rejected. But with the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species, all that changed. The problem that surrounded Darwin's concept of evolution was not the idea that man came from apes. That part could be explained religiously. In fact, 1,000 years before Darwin, Al-Jahiz, an Islamic thinker, proposed the entire theoretical side of evolution, along with the material causes, changes to the species, and the adaptation that becomes a whole new species. No one batted an eye, and it was widely accepted throughout the Islamic world. But what he did was give God the control over how the process actually played out, in terms of the changes ultimately adding up to the will of God, the telos that God imposes on creation. Al-Jahiz did not argue that we can see or calculate out this process of God's decisions, just that it was present. And this makes perfect sense from his perspective because teleology was the assumption on all levels and across every science. But when Darwin proposed the same theory 1,000 years later, he changed that mechanism a bit. And he changed it because about 200 years earlier, in the 1650s, Descartes had the brilliant idea that all things that are real must be made up of material substances. And that means that if there is a part of a process that you are describing, it is either physical and observable, or it does not exist. Now, of course, Darwin could not find anything like God's plan as a mechanical part of evolution, so he could not include it in the process. And of course, he couldn't find it because it is a metaphysical notion, and it used to be taken as a basic assumption. And that means that without a telos, evolution became purely a matter of blind chance, or random changes that were not headed anywhere, had no meaning, and had no goal to be aimed at. The difference here is that religious ethics have that bit with the immaterial feature of human beings, and they have the reason for telos as something that is not part of the universe, since it is the source of the creation of the universe. So now you have the rejection of the purely material world axiom that was made by Descartes, and you have it in a way that does not reject that matter is determined and acts in a determined way, which is the basis of science. Instead, this idea adds a feature that is consistent with the basic religious axiom of purpose in creation. That purpose is not material, and so you don't look to find it as a material feature. You still get the material explanations for matter, but when it comes to the question why, which is outside the realm of science anyway, there is an answer that does not conflict with the material study of matter, because the why is inherently a metaphysical point. Now notice that you can't make the same argument through Aristotle, because the presence of the immaterial soul is not built in there, at least not in the same way that it is for religion. In fact, Aristotle is taken to be quite a secular thinker and a rationalist in the sense of rejecting religious thought. This is why the problem of telos for Aristotle can't be addressed the same way that it can for religious thought. For more information on the whole immaterial soul as purely philosophical exercise, there are links in the description. Problem 2 is the difference existing between religions, and this seems like a fairly massive issue. If you have different and incompatible systems that arise out of the same metaphysical structure, how is that coherent? If Buddhism is correct, then Christianity is false, and vice versa. And that means that even if the general system might be coherent, the specifics may not be. In fact, just because a religion is claimed does not mean that you have a coherent system. Thus, we're forced to do a full workup of each religion, each branch of each religion, and so on, to make sure that the internal and external coherence actually works. So this handy-dandy layout here is just a general guide. You're still stuck having to do all the work for any specific religion. And then you have to hope that the content makes at least some religions drop out. And you also have to contend with the probability point, based on how likely is it that this reading of the text that makes sense is the intended one. How far do you have to bend over backwards to make it work? Now, if you're left with multiple religions that are internally and externally coherent, then you have no meaningful way of picking one over the other. And that's assuming that you start off with the exact same axioms and just have a different revelation text. A possible solution of sorts can be found with compatible religions, either as stackable ideas, for example, Daoism and Buddhism come together to make Neo-Confucianism, or as building up of ideas over time. For example, Judaism goes to Christianity, goes to Islam. The issue that arises here, however, is that the building up is only seen as such by the adherents of the later religion. That is, Jews don't see Christians as a continuation of Abrahamic traditions, and the stacking effect can be seen as an improper alteration of original ideologies by either side. Finally, the other big issue is the immutable core rules, because they're, well, immutable. There is no means of adapting the core ideas over time. The core rules are either absolute, or you lose the whole ethical system. Or perhaps, if you prefer, you end up with a different ethical system. While the idea that some rules are beyond adaptability is commonly pitched as a negative, it should be noted that this is considered a key necessary feature of numerous ethical theories. We don't want rules like don't murder and don't rape to be anything other than immutable. These should not be subject to change because they express a core understanding of an axiomatic reality. To murder is to act unjustifiably by definition. If what is unjustifiable can become justifiable, then there is simply no rules. Not really. While we tend to be fine with the rules on murder and rape being immutable, we also tend to chafe at some of the other rules, especially as regards things that modern political theory has designated to belong to the private sphere. However, by the above structura of religious ethics, this is precisely where there cannot be any compromise. And why not? Well, because the system is not set up by our wants and desires. It's set up by the telos of the universe and the telos of humanity. And we have already noted that the emotional reactionary position is precisely what leads to the displacement of telos, of the will of God, from its rightful place, and it leads towards material and immaterial destruction. The inability to appeal rules and processes which seem to be irrelevant to us is one of the most often cited reasons for people leaving their faith, as for example in the question of gay marriage. But if you will recall the game-like layout of religious thought from the last lecture, you will also recall that there is no place for such desires to meaningfully affect the rules. For better or worse, the rules are absolute. So religious ethics are, in my opinion, one of the hardest ethical theories to work with. Part of the reason is that they require both an abstract sense of metaphysical theories and structura systems, as well as a really good grasp on religion as such, not to mention a good grasp of particular religions in order to adequately populate their structura. Another reason for the difficulty is that we do not commonly study religion in this abstract way. In fact, most of us don't study religion at all, and if we are religious, we tend to be religious in an odd kind of secular way. We are religious privately, but ethical in a socially governed way. The final reason for the difficulty may be the fact that religious ethics are actually rather complex, because they are personal and interpersonal. They govern social behaviors on an independent basis as well as governmental and political basis. They reach into every aspect of our lives, and knowing how to appropriately shift between different spheres of social responsibility and religious obligation at each of these spheres is no easy task. Traditionally, this was taught over decades of one's life, during which one was habituated into the appropriate differences in application. Trying to take it all in a single sitting is next to impossible. Finally, religious ethics is commonly counted as a deontic ethical system, meaning that it is based on duty to do the right thing as a feature of intent. However, you may have noticed that, unlike Kantian ethics, there is no issue of lacking hierarchical ordering of values. This is because, although the deontic features are present, the teleological basis aimed at embodiment of the will of God provides the rank ordering of values. Thus, the Kantian inability to resolve competing obligations is resolved in a way that is, in some ways, reminiscent of Ross's prima facie duties, but with a coherent reason for deciding which values take precedence. This concludes this lecture on religious ethical theory. I hope it has given you a better understanding of why religious ethics really should be understood as part of the philosophical ethical canon. In our next lecture, we will turn to the final piece of this puzzle as we consider the nature of obligations in secular and religious systems and read George Mavro's article, The Queerness of Morality. If you have questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section or shoot me an email. Thank you.